fishing. He wants to climb up a mountain and do something crazy. I'm like, man, give me a bench and make it as easy as possible. And I have to tell him all the time, Tyler, I'm a lazy fisherman. If you want me to go with you, remember, I'm a lazy fisherman. Anyway, back to the story. He says, my friends Bart and Randall did not play it safe and easy. When they asked a forest ranger about fishing in a particular lake, one ranger responded, oh, I would not try to fish in that lake. It's a remote lake, and you have to climb 2,000 feet up one side of a mountain and then 2,000 back down the other side to even get there. That sounds like what Tyler wants to do. That was all Bart and Randall needed to hear. They were packed and on their way. The fishing was so good there, they tell me, that they caught something on nearly every cast. Still not worth it to me. Perhaps so, but I saw the pictures of them standing on top of that ridge and the sheer cliff they descended and then ascended on the way back. I was not sorry I stayed back at my favorite fishing hole only a few feet above the water. Definitely sounds like the difference between my fishing and Tyler's fishing. But reading the account of Jonathan's personal campaign against the Philistines in this text reminds me of the picture of Bart and Randall perched at the top of that cliff. Just as the fisherman who stayed back on the fishing trip did, Saul safely rests in the shade of a tree, while Jonathan and his armor bearer scale a substantial cliff on their way to do battle with a garrison of Philistines. Neither the climb nor the overwhelming odds in the Philistines' favor keep Jonathan from doing battle with these enemies of Israel. But as we shall see, there is much more to the story than just a dangerous climb. As we give careful consideration to this passage, we will learn much about Saul and Jonathan. They're different examples of leadership, and we learn much about their trust in God, or their lack of trust in God in Saul's case. But before we get into our text, I want to review just for a minute. Israel demands a king, and God promises to grant their request. That's way back in 1 Samuel 8. Through a sequence of events, God designates Saul as Israel's king. That is chapters 9 and 10. When Nahash and the Ammonites threatened Jabesh Gilead by, plucking their right eye out, Saul is overcome by the Spirit of God and slaughters a yoke of oxen, sending pieces throughout the land and threatening to do the same to the oxen of anyone who refuses to come to Israeli aid to defend their brethren. This, of course, results in 330,000 Israeli troops gathering for war with the Ammonites and, of course, a great Israelite victory. That's chapter 11. Samuel cautions the Israelites about becoming too optimistic about their new king, reminding them that it is God, not men, who throughout Israel's history has delivered his people. If the Israelites rebel against God, failing to trust and obey him, they, along with their king, will be handed over to their enemies. If Israel does fear God, then God will spare them and their king. That's chapter 12. Now here we are in chapter 13. Things quickly begin to sour for Israel and for Saul, their king. Jonathan's attack on a Philistine garrison greatly angers the Philistines, ticks them off, and prompts a massive Philistine military buildup in Israel. So as the chapter unfolds, things seem to go from bad to worse. Saul is forced in his mind, well, not forced in his mind, Saul is forced to summon the Israelites to war after having recently sent them home. I got ahead of myself, but the volunteers are few and far between, and when the Israelites realize the size of the Philistine army, they begin to desert, hiding wherever they can. When Samuel seems to delay his arrival, Saul feels like he has to take charge by sacrificing the burnt offerings and intent on offering the peace offerings. Samuel arrives just after the burnt offerings, rejecting Saul's weak excuses and rebuking him for his foolishness. I can't talk. Further, he announces to Saul that because of his disobedience, his kingdom will not endure, because God has chosen a man to be king whose heart is in tune with his. Let's read our text. 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting at verse 15. And Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah, not Oprah, Ophrah, to the land of Shul. Another company turned toward Beth Horon, and another company turned toward the border that looks down on the valley of Zeboam toward the wilderness. Now this is interesting right here. And there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan his son had them. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. Title of this section is Mission Impossible. So we pick up the story with Samuel leaving Saul in Gilgal and going up to Gibeah, and so it happens without showing him what he should do. Samuel gives Saul no guidance as to how he should deal with the massive Philistine invasion, which results from Jonathan's attack on the Philistine garrison at Geba. In preparation for war, Saul numbers his troops, finding a whopping 600 men with him, ready for battle. Given the thousands of Philistine troops, the odds are terribly stacked against Israel and her new king. Now, we read this and we may envision a little bit of a standoff between the Philistine army stationed at Michmash and the Israelite forces under Saul and Jonathan stationed at Geba. But it's not really the case. And I would almost expect a huge battle scene now, but that's not how it goes down. And while the main army of the Philistines seems to be dug in at Michmash, 3 parties of raiders, verse 17, are sent out. One is sent to the north toward Ophrah, another to the west toward Beth Horon, and the third to the east toward the wilderness, and the Israelites are to the south. These raiders or destroyers appear to be special forces troops whose task is to kill, burn, or in any other way destroy human life, cattle, buildings, or crops. The longer these raiding parties are free to go about bringing destruction wherever they go, the more serious Israel's situation becomes. If the Philistines are not defeated and driven out of the land, there's a whole lot of trouble ahead for Israel. Grossly outnumbered, the Israelites are so desperately frightened, they're deserting in droves. Saul has foolishly offered the burnt offerings, been rebuked by Samuel. Raiding parties are roaming about the land, leaving destruction behind them wherever they go. And now the few remaining Israelite troops are poorly armed when compared to the Philistines. For the Philistines, at least, the Iron Age has come. Their technology enables them to have swords and spears of iron and chariots with iron wheels. It enables farmers to have tools which stay sharp longer and not as inclined to break. The Israelites, they're not given the Philistine technology. The Philistines sell iron farming implements to the Israelites, but they do not sell iron weapons to the Israelites. I guess you can't blame them from their position. And they certainly don't allow them, the Israelites, to make or possess those weapons. This, obviously, from a human standpoint, gives the Philistines a decisive edge. A little bit of a pun there, but whatever. That gives them a decisive edge over the Israelites. The writer informs us of this edge and that only Saul and Jonathan possess swords. That's super important. Things don't look good for Israel. So agriculturally speaking, the Israelites are virtually dependent on the Philistines. They've got to purchase their farming tools from them, and then they have to pay to have them sharpened. Every day of their lives, the Israelites are reminded of their position in relation to the Philistines. Militarily speaking, man, you could say things are hopeless for the Israelites. The Philistines have a massive, well-equipped army and raiding parties which roam about Israel at will, bringing death and destruction with them. Israel has a small army of very frightened men, many of whom are bouncing, with some even defecting to the Philistines, which we'll read next week in verse 21 of chapter 14. Israel's king, Saul, he is reluctant at best, like on a good day now, right? With such vastly inferior technology, the Israelites are between a rock and a hard place. Let's read on. One day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other, Seneh. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." And his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign to us." I ain't gonna lie, to me this plan stinks, but that's just me. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And the men of the garrison held Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. Wow. To me, that's a stinky plan, but I guess if God's in control, right? The title of this section is Saul's Folly and Jonathan's Faith. But what a contrast our author brings out between Saul and his son Jonathan. The nation of Israel at war, desperately outnumbered and miserably equipped, and yet Saul is found under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. Just like that fisherman who stayed under a tree, right? While Saul stays out of the sun and safely out of reach of the Philistines, his son Jonathan is about to take on some more Philistines, accompanied by his brave armor bearer. But Jonathan does not ask permission from his father, nor does he let his father know, hey, this is what we're going to do. And he doesn't let anyone else know of his departure either. I, of course, think that he knows what his father will think of any aggressive action against the Philistines. He knows that Saul doesn't want to cause trouble with the Philistines, but Jonathan no longer wants Israel to be troubled by these Philistines. So there sits Saul under a shade tree in the area. And remember, this is why it's so important that there's only two swords. There's only two swords being held by Israelites. And Saul has one of the swords. I mean, maybe he's using the sword to cut open pomegranates. I don't know. But that seems like a waste of swords, right? But there with Saul is Ahitub, brother of Ichabod, son of Phinehas, and grandson of Eli. Ahitub wears or carries with him the ephod. one of the means for discerning the will of God. And Saul does not get instructions from Samuel at Gilgal because of his disobedience. And now he has the ephod and a priest with him, yet he still never inquires of God as to, hey, what should we do? Jonathan, however, has a definite sense of the will of God, which prompts him to take action. First, Jonathan knows he knows much about the will of God from Israel's history and from the nature of God himself. Jonathan's words to his armor bearer are filled with a sense of faith and a sense of duty to God. They are words that explain his confidence and his action, and which also confirm the loyalty of his armor bearer, which I don't know why the armor bearer wasn't named. He deserves to be named here. But I'm going to read verse 6 again. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." The Philistines are uncircumcised. Now, in our context, that's a super weird assertion, right? Let's go get them. They're not circumcised, right? But the only point really is that the Philistines, they don't have a covenant relationship with God, as do the Israelites. That's the point of that. The covenant that God made with Israel assures them of God's presence and protection from their enemies. God brings them out of Egyptian slavery and promises to give them the land of Canaan and freedom from the surrounding nations. Israel surely does not have this right now. Philistine garrisons occupy the land, and Israelites cannot even farm without even buying tools and maintenance from the Philistines. Jonathan understands that God does not intend for his people to be enslaved by the surrounding nations. He understands that it is now the king's responsibility to lead the people into battle against the enemies of Israel and their God. And he also understands from God's nature and from Israel's history that Israel's victory is not dependent upon the number of troops, or Israel's victory is not dependent on the kind of weapons that they possess. If it is God's will for Israel to prevail over her enemies, it is not going to take 600 men. It might only take 2. The question in Jonathan's mind is not whether God can deliver the Philistines into the hands of the Israelites, but whether it's God's will. Saul has the priest and the ephod, but he does not care to inquire of God. He prefers to sit under that shade tree. And so Jonathan determines another way to discern the will of God with regard to his intended foray against the Philistine garrison. Jonathan seeks a sign from God, which will indicate whether he and his armor bearer should go up and attack the Philistines. Michmash and Gibeah are 2 high points in the area. Access to Michmash is through the Michmash Pass, which is a very narrow pass, apparently the course of a small stream. The Philistines seem to have a small company of soldiers stationed at the top of this pass where they can spot anyone who tries to pass through to Michmash and stop them. Jonathan's plan is to scale down the rocky face of one cliff, and then at the bottom, make his presence known to the Philistines stationed atop the cliff on the other side of the narrow pass. If the soldiers indicate they're coming down to attack Jonathan and his armor bearer, they're not going to attempt to go up the cliff to the Philistines on the other side. I would say it's also time to run, but the text doesn't say that. I don't know. But if, however, the Philistines challenge him, hey, come on up here. That's wild to me. This will be the sign that God wants them to make the dangerous climb up to the Philistine outpost, and that he will give Israel victory over them. That amazes me. That's what you're all right. So with his armor bearer is a man. He is a man. This armor bearer is a man. So with his armor bearer's full support, these 2 valiant Israelites make themselves visible. Hey guys! Right? And then the Philistine lookouts spot them, and they suppose that they've come out of hiding in the rocks. So the Philistines then, hey, why don't you guys come up here? We've got something to show you. I've fallen for that before, but that's a different story. But I'm a little surprised at the Philistines' response. Why do they not just send boulders down and rocks down upon Jonathan and his helper, right? Why do they not dispatch troops down to them in the pass below to kill them? Why, when these two men are in their most vulnerable position as they scale up this rocky cliff, why don't the Philistines not take advantage of their vulnerability and kill them quickly and easily? And I think the answer is in our text. Philistines invite the two Israelites up to tell them something. And at first I thought this was a challenge, and I guess it could be. You know, for these Philistines, maybe it was getting a little boring, right? And it would have been too easy to send rocks down. And the Philistines, they want a challenge. They want a little contest. So they intend to let the two come to the top where they can engage them. But I think there's a different explanation. For one, it could just be that God just softened their hearts. And they have no explanation except they just felt like they should. But even still, I think there is a different explanation. I believe the Philistines let Jonathan and his armor bearer come up to them so maybe they would surrender to them and join with them against Israel. The Philistines have to know they have the upper hand. They know they have superior weapons, and they vastly outnumber the 600 soldiers who follow Saul. They know they can send raiders about the country with very little resistance from the Israelites. And they have already added a number of Israelites to their own troops. So to them, why not allow these two frightened Israelites who are crawling out of their holes to give themselves up and join the winning army? For the Philistines to take this position is certainly not a sure thing, but it does make for a convincing sign, at least in Jonathan's mind. And so they climb up that steep, rocky cliff to the awaiting Philistines. Philistines, they did not bargain for what was about to happen. Jonathan begins to wield his sword, the only sword besides the one under the pomegranate tree. Jonathan begins to wield his sword, and those left alive behind him as his armor bearer dispatches. Within a short distance and a short time, this lookout squad is dead, making it possible for the Israelites to come through the pass of Michmash and pursue the Philistines. And there's more, though. If God is with Jonathan in his attack on the Philistine outpost, he is now about to reveal his mighty arm by giving Israel a victory over the Philistine garrison at Michmash. Verse 15 again. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earthquake, and it became a very great panic. I mean, it was, of course, Elvis who sang, I'm all shook up, right? But here, it was the Philistines that were all shook up, right? And all starts with the Israelite troops who follow Saul, and they see how desperately weak their position is against the Philistines. They also must sense the weakness of Saul's leadership, but they're in serious trouble. As our author informs us, they're all shook up. But does this keep God from giving Israel the victory? Certainly not. God proceeds now to shake up the Philistines. But imagine, if you can, the smug sense of security the Philistines must feel as they are safely hidden away at Michmash. In order for the puny Israelite army to get to them, they have to pass through the Michmash Pass, and a mere 20 men can easily hold off such a force. The Philistines find their security in a narrow pass at the high point of the mountains, protected by a massive rock, which is all well and good until an earthquake occurs. Now this former place of safety becomes the most dangerous place in the world. Saul and his watchmen look on as the Philistine army surges in one direction and then another, probably in synchronous motion with the ground, which is rolling about like sea billows in a storm. But all of the things which once seemed to assure them of having the edge over the Israelites now turn into liabilities. And of course, if you read ahead in verse 20, you see that in the panic and all the commotion, their swords kill one another, not the Israelites. Their horses and chariots are useless, as in their terror the animals refuse to obey. Gaping cracks appear in the ground, and rock falls from the sides of the pass above. Absolute panic prevails everywhere, preventing any attack and hindering any retreat. The Philistines become their own worst enemy, killing one another in the insanity of these moments. The application, we'll look at the application real quick. Any comments before I get to the application? Okay. But what an incredible passage from which we can draw several principles and their implications for us as Christians today. Saul and Jonathan provide us with both negative and positive examples of spiritual leadership. The words trust and obey may not sum up all there is to say about the Christian life, but they certainly describe two vitally important dimensions. The first application we see by comparing Saul and Jonathan's leadership, Saul's leadership can be characterized as fear. Saul is a man of little faith. Like Winnie the Pooh is a bear of little brains, Saul was a man of little faith. The word fear seems to better characterize this man. He was afraid to tell his uncle that, if you go back earlier in the book, he was afraid to tell his uncle that Samuel has anointed him as king of Israel. Shortly after, he hid in the luggage when he knows he will be publicly selected as the king. He is afraid he will lose all of his troops, and so he forces himself to offer the burnt offering. And it seems that he is so afraid to take on the Philistines that he does as little as possible to attack or provoke them. He walked on eggshells. The Saul we see in chapter 11, when he got the 330,000 troops together, that was the new Saul, right? Which God brings to pass as the Spirit comes mightily on him. But this new Saul does not seem to last beyond chapter 11. Now we're back to the old Saul that we find elsewhere. It is the old Saul we see described in chapters 13 and 14, just hanging out under a pomegranate tree. When the new Saul summons the Israelites to war, 330,000 report for duty. When the old Saul summons Israel to Gilgal, only a small fraction of this number report. And many of those who do report, they desert out of fear. And Saul's fear, it's contagious. Since he does not trust and obey God, his followers do not trust or obey him. But how different Jonathan is. Jonathan's leadership can be characterized by faith. John is a man of faith. He trusts God to give him the victory over the Philistine garrison in chapter 13. He is willing to take on the Philistines in the Michmash Pass, even when it involves scaling a rocky cliff with his armor, accompanied only by his one servant. This is a man who trusts God regardless of what the odds appear to be. And here is a man whom his armor bearer is willing to follow into battle, even when it looks like suicide. I mean, didn't that mission look like suicide? Why was he willing to do that? I believe it's because Jonathan is not only a man of personal faith, but a man whose faith is contagious. Those around Saul tremble because he trembles. But those close to Jonathan trust God because he trusts God. Which leads to a very simple definition of spiritual leadership. Spiritual leadership begins with a man's faith in God, which compels him to obediently take action in the face of obstacles and opposition, and motivates others to follow him in his obedience. Ultimately, spiritual leadership is not about looks, thank God. It's not about charm. Got a little bit of that. It's not about motivational or management techniques. Spiritual leadership is about men and women who trust God and obey his word. And in so doing, attract others to trust God and obey his word. See, Saul is not a spiritual leader, but Jonathan, oh, he is. Now, a second application pertains to our appraisal of the success of leader. Let me just try to state this as a principle. When leaders succeed, it is ultimately due to the grace of God. And often may be the result of the faithfulness of others whose supportive ministry are not nearly so evident. Now, I don't want to take away all credit from Saul, although he doesn't deserve much in this text today. But I do believe our text makes it very clear that Saul is successful in his leadership because of the grace of God. Not because of his skill, certainly not because of his courage, and not because of his greatness. And the victory Israel wins over the Philistines is not due to Saul's initiative, but the initiative of his son Jonathan. And it makes you wonder, how many times are those that are lifted up as great leaders, how often are they the recipients of praise that really belongs to those who are behind the scenes making them great? Many are those who seek the spotlight, But blessed are those who make those in authority over them look good while standing clear of the spotlight. And that's exactly what we have from Jonathan. Third, along with many others in the Bible, our text gives us a whole new perspective on situations that appear to be impossible. Here, as elsewhere, God brings his people into circumstances that seem impossible. Again, we find a very important principle illustrated in our text. God purposely brings men into impossible situations to make it perfectly clear that we cannot save ourselves. And he delivers us in a way that brings him all the glory for doing so. God loves to show his strength through our weaknesses. Chapter 13 of 1 Samuel shows Israel and Saul in all their weaknesses. The Israelite soldiers are vastly outnumbered by the Philistines and desperately outclassed in terms of their weapons. But in spite of what appears to be a hopeless situation, God brings about a significant victory over the Philistines. And this happens because two men, one without a sword, trust God enough to take on the Philistines. God turns the trembling of the Israelites into the trembling of an earthquake, so powerful that it brings confusion and chaos into the ranks of the Philistines. And most of those who die at the edge of the sword die at the hand of their own Philistine brethren. Many Christians seem to have faith when victory appears possible through merely human effort, but they collapse when circumstances appear impossible. We should learn from Jonathan that God's victory is not contingent upon our own strength, not contingent upon the resources we have or the lack of resources that we have. The question is not, can God do it? The question is it his will? I love Jonathan's confidence in God. May we show the same confidence. Any comments before we dismiss? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And it looking like it's in the other nation's favor is what gives them a little bit of confidence to come attack Israel. And God's got their back. Nothing anybody can do about it. Lord, you're good. Lord, let us have the courage of Jonathan. Lord, help us to trust you. Lord, I just pray for your blessings on the people of Woodland Christian Center. Go with us. Shine your face, Lord, on the people of Woodland Christian Center. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed, and there's goodies. What? Well, why don't we go back to John and pray for him back there so he doesn't have to make the track. Yeah.